A cruel African king believed servants were born only to obey, never worthy of justice. One day, his oldest servant of 30 years stood boldly and said, "If I rule for just one night, your kingdom will improve." The king laughed, then exploded in rage. "Fine," he declared. "Tomorrow you will be king for 24 hours, and I'll be the servant. Fail and you die." What the servant did next was so simple, yet in just one day, people stopped praying for the real king and started praying for the servant instead. The heartbreaking truth the king discovered that night changed everything forever. Hit subscribe, then we begin the story. Dawn in the ancient African kingdom of Zambora did not arrive gently. It crept in slowly, almost apologetically, spreading pale light across red soil, mud brick homes, and the towering palace that sat like a watchful predator at the center of the land. From a distance, the palace looked magnificent. High walls, carved pillars, banners swaying in the early wind. But anyone who stepped closer could feel something was wrong. The air near the palace felt heavy, as though sound itself was afraid to travel too far. Guards stood shoulder to shoulder at the gates, spears upright, eyes forward, expressions carved from stone. No one greeted the morning with laughter. No children played near the walls. Even the marketplace nearby kept its noise low, voices dropping instinctively, as if the king might hear them from his throne. In Zambora, fear had become a habit, and silence had learned how to survive. People woke each day not asking what they hoped would happen, but what they must avoid so they could live through it. The king who ruled Zambora believed this fear was not a flaw of his reign, but its greatest strength. He sat on his throne convinced that authority meant distance, that respect was born only from terror. To him, a ruler who listened was already losing. A ruler who forgave was inviting weakness. He ruled with sharp words and sharper punishments, certain that a kingdom held together by fear would never fall apart. Servants, in his eyes, were not people with stories or thoughts. They were shadows meant to move when ordered and disappear when no longer needed. He often reminded his ministers that servants were born to obey, not to understand. In court, a servant who hesitated was struck. One who looked up without permission was humiliated. One who spoke out of turn vanished quietly, their absence explained with a shrug. The king called this order. The people called it survival. And over time, cruelty became routine, so familiar that even outrage grew tired of speaking. Among the hundreds of servants who moved silently through the palace corridors, there was one man who had learned how to exist without being noticed. His name was Kilo. For 30 years, he had walked those halls before sunrise and long after nightfall, carrying water, cleaning floors, delivering messages, and standing still when told to stand. He had watched ministers come and go, alliances form and break, and punishments handed down without reason. Kilo was not young, and he was not strong the way soldiers were strong, but there was something steady about him. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed things others missed. He remembered faces, words, and patterns. While others lowered their heads out of fear, Kilo lowered his head out of understanding. He knew when to stay quiet, and more importantly, when silence itself became dangerous. To the palace, he was invisible. To the servants, he was something else entirely. When food was scarce, he shared his portion. When someone was beaten unfairly, he cleaned their wounds without asking questions. When despair grew heavy, he reminded them, softly, that cruelty did not mean truth. He never spoke against the king, yet he saw the cracks in the kingdom more clearly than anyone who wore silk. The day everything changed again like any other, until the court gathered and the familiar tension sharpened into something volatile. Ministers argued over missing grain and unpaid soldiers, each man carefully shifting blame away from himself. Guards stood stiffly, pretending not to hear whispers of bribery that floated openly through the hall. The king grew angry, his voice rising as he accused everyone and no one at once. His rage filled the chamber, bouncing off stone walls, demanding silence and obedience. Servants stood frozen at the edges of the room, eyes lowered, breath shallow. Kilo stood among them, holding a tray, watching the scene unfold as he had watched countless times before. But something felt different. The lies were louder, the injustice clearer, the cost of silence heavier than it had ever been. When the king demanded to know why his kingdom felt rotten beneath its gold, no one answered. The room drowned in fear. And then, before Kilo could stop himself, his voice broke through the stillness. Calm, respectful, unshaking, he stepped forward and spoke words no servant had ever dared to say aloud. In that moment, the palace did not erupt in noise. It fell into a silence, so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. And slowly, the king rose from his throne. The king did not shout at first. He did not signal the guards or slam his staff against the stone floor. He simply stared at Kilo, and that silence was more frightening than any punishment the court had ever witnessed. Ministers shifted uneasily, unsure whether to laugh or kneel. Guards tightened their grip on their spears, waiting for the smallest nod that would give them permission to strike. Kilo remained where he stood, his hands steady, his eyes lowered, not in defiance, but in respect. The king stepped down from the throne slowly, each step echoing to the hall like a warning. He circled Kilo as one might circle an animal that had unexpectedly spoken. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost amused, and that frightened everyone even more. He asked Kilo to repeat what he had said. The servant did not hesitate. His words came again, just as steady, just as quiet. If he ruled for one night, the kingdom would be better. Laughter burst from ministers then, sharp and mocking. Some covered their mouths. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A servant daring to imagine the throne was not just foolish. It was unforgivable. The king raised a hand, and the laughter died instantly. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that never reached the eyes. He said the servant had entertained him, and entertainment, he declared, deserved a reward. But in Zambora, rewards often wore the same face as punishment. The king turned to the court and announced his decision loudly, clearly, so no one could claim they had misunderstood. At sunrise, Kilo would sit on the throne. For one night and one day, he would rule as king. The Real king would step down and live as a servant among the servants. If, by dawn the next morning, the kingdom showed signs of disorder, if chaos spread, if respect vanished, if even one mistake could be traced to Kilo's rule, then Kilo would be executed in the public square. The king's voice never rose. He spoke as though he were discussing the weather. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some ministers smiled eagerly, already imagining the spectacle. Others looked away, uneasy at the cruelty of the game. Kilo felt the weight of death settle on his shoulders, but he did not retreat. He bowed deeply, accepting the terms, knowing that refusal would mean death anyway. As the court dissolved into murmurs, Kilo was led away, not to his cell, but back to the servant quarters, where word of what happened spread faster than fire through dry grass. Some servants stared at him as if he were already a ghost. Others grabbed his hands in secret, whispering prayers, warnings, fears. They begged him to apologize, to beg for mercy, to say it had been a misunderstanding. Kilo listened, his face calm but his heart heavy. He knew the king had not granted him power. He had granted him a trap. That night, as darkness wrapped the palace, Kilo sat alone on a woven mat in the corner of the servants' hall. Sleep refused to come. His thoughts wandered to memories of hunger, of bruises hidden beneath sleeves, of children who had watched their parents disappear after palace summons. He did not dream of command or recognition. He dreamed of quiet mornings without fear. He asked himself whether one day was enough to change anything at all. And yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred, a sense that silence had already cost too much, and that even one day of truth might be worth a lifetime. Elsewhere in the palace, the king feasted. Wine flowed freely, and ministers laughed louder than usual, relieved that the servant's fate was sealed. The king spoke openly of the spectacle to come, mocking the idea that kindness could rule a kingdom. He boasted that by morning, the people would beg for his return. In his mind, this exchange was already over. Power, he believed, was something learned by birth and blood, not by listening or care. He planned the execution carefully, imagining the lesson it would teach. Never let those below you forget their place. Outside, guards joked about which part of the palace the servant king would break first. Inside, no one noticed how the laughter sounded thinner than before, or how uneasily some eyes avoided the king's gaze. Pride filled the room, But beneath it lay something fragile, something afraid of being tested. Just before dawn, Kilo was summoned. Servants bathed him, dressed him in robes he had only ever touched while cleaning, and placed him in a quiet chamber near the throne room. His hands trembled for the first time as he felt the weight of the fabric, the unfamiliar softness against skin that had known only rough cloth. From the window, he could see the first hint of light breaking over the rooftops of Zambora. Somewhere in the palace, the king was being stripped of his symbols, his crown, his rings, his authority, if only for a night. The horns announcing morning began to sound. Footsteps echoed, doors opened, and as the sun rose fully over the kingdom, the impossible happened. A servant walked toward the throne, carrying not ambition, but a burden heavier than fear. The throne room felt different the moment Kilo stepped inside it. The air that once pressed down with fear now seemed uncertain, as if the palace itself did not know how to behave. Ministers stood in their usual places, but their confidence had thinned. Guards watched closely, hands ready, unsure whether they were protecting the throne or watching for a mistake. When Kilo reached the steps and turned to face the court, a low murmur moved through the hall. He did not walk like a man drunk on power. His steps were careful, almost hesitant, as though he understood that the throne was not a prize but a weight. The crown was placed on his head, and for a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Outside the palace walls, the real king, now dressed in coarse servant's cloth, was handed a broom and pointed toward the courtyard. No announcement was made, no explanation given. He was simply another worker among many, and for the first time in his life, no one bowed. Kilo sat on the throne, and instead of issuing commands, he asked for silence. The request startled the court more than any shout would have. He looked at the ministers one by one, not with suspicion but with patience. When he spoke, his voice carried across the hall without effort. He told them that for one day, there would be no punishments for speaking honestly, no rewards for flattering words. Anyone who came before the throne would be heard fully, without interruption. Some ministers exchanged glances, unsure whether this was a trick. Others smirked, convinced the servant would lose control within hours. But Kilo did not rush. He did not threaten. He simply waited. Slowly, cautiously, people began to step forward. A farmer spoke of stolen grain. A widow spoke of unpaid labor. A guard admitted, trembling, that bribes had become common because wages were never enough. Each confession landed like a stone dropped into still water. No one was dragged away. No one was struck. Kilo listened, nodding, absorbing every word as if it mattered. Because to him, it did. Beyond the palace gates, the former king scrubbed stone floors under the sun. His hands, used to holding scepters, blistered quickly when he ordered another servant to help him. The servant laughed softly and told him to work faster. For the first time, the king felt what it was like to be ignored. Guards passed him without acknowledgement. Ministers who once bowed now looked through him, as if he were part of the wall. At midday, when food was distributed, he received the same small portion as everyone else, and no more. As he ate in silence, he watched servants share what little they had with one another. No overseer demanded it. No order forced it. They simply did it, as they always had. Confusion began to creep into the king's thoughts. He had ruled through fear for years, yet here was order without his voice, work without his threat. The idea unsettled him more than rebellion ever had. Inside the throne room, Kilo began to act, not with grand decrees, but with small, deliberate choices. He ordered the kitchens to open their stores to the hungry waiting outside the gates. He instructed guards to escort the weak safely home, rather than chase them away. When a minister was caught lying to protect his own wealth, Kilo did not shout or punish him publicly. He simply asked him to sit in silence for the rest of the day, listening to the people he had ignored. The effect was immediate and unsettling. Fear no longer hid corruption. Without terror, lies struggled to stand. Word spread quickly through the city. People who had never dared approach the palace began to gather, not shouting, not protesting, but waiting, hoping. For the first time in memory, the palace gates opened without violence. For the first time, voices rose without trembling. As evening approached, something changed in the rhythm of Zambora. The The markets grew louder, not with chaos, but with conversation. Children played closer to the palace walls. Servants walked a little straighter. In the quiet corners of the city, people whispered prayers, not for the king they feared, but for the servant who listened. Kilo felt the weight of those prayers settle on him, heavier than the crown itself. He knew this peace was fragile. He knew dawn would bring judgment. And yet, as he looked out over the kingdom from the throne, he understood something with aching clarity. Power did not create dignity. Dignity invited order. And for the first time, the palace felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Night settled over the kingdom slowly, like a truth that could no longer be avoided. Lamps were lit along the palace corridors, their flames flickering against stone walls that had witnessed generations of fear. From the throne, Kilo watched the darkness arrive, aware that with every passing moment, the experiment drew closer to its end. Outside those walls, the former king moved through the servant quarters unnoticed, exhausted in a way he had never known. His muscles ached, his back burned, but worse than the pain was the realization that no one cared. When he stumbled, no hand reached out to steady him. When he spoke, his words dissolved into the air without consequence. Orders once powerful enough to bend men's spines now carried no weight at all. He watched servants organize their tasks quietly, solving problems without shouting, without threats. They adjusted when things went wrong. They supported one another without instruction. The king felt something crack inside him then, not anger, but confusion. He had believed obedience came from fear, yet here was cooperation born from necessity and mutual respect. As he lay on a rough mat that night, listening to whispered conversations and distant laughter, he understood for the first time what it meant to be invisible. Inside the palace, the truth revealed itself without cruelty. Ministers who once thrived under intimidation now struggled. Without fear to hide behind, their incompetence showed. Some attempted to assert authority, only to find no one flinched. Others tried to flatter Kilo, but he gently redirected them to the people waiting outside. Guards, and used the restraint, found themselves uncertain. They had been trained to strike first, not to listen. Yet under Kilo's quiet guidance, even they began to change. He asked them questions no ruler had ever asked about their families, their pay, their worries. Some answered cautiously. Others broke down. And through it all, the kingdom continued to function. Grain was distributed fairly. Disputes were settled calmly. Lies, when spoken, fell flat without punishment to give them power. News traveled fast through Zambora, carried by mouths unafraid to speak. People gathered at night, not in fear patrols, but in conversation. They spoke the servants' names softly, not as rebellion, but as gratitude. The palace, once a symbol of distance, now felt closer than it ever had. The former king rose before dawn, sleep having offered him no rest. His mind replayed every moment of the day like a wound that refused to close. He saw himself in the guards who took bribes, in the ministers who twisted truth, in the silence he had mistaken for peace. And for the first time, shame outweighed pride. As the sky lightened, he returned to the palace steps, standing among servants who no longer feared the building before them. Inside, Kilo remained seated on the throne, aware that the calm surrounding him was temporary, but real. When the horns announced morning, both men felt it, the weight of what had been learned and what could no longer be denied. The night had not overturned the kingdom. It had exposed it, and in that exposure, something irreversible had taken root. The morning sun spilled gold across the palace courtyard, catching on banners, stone, and the glinting edges of spears. For the first time in memory, the kingdom of Zambora felt quiet but alive, as though the very air was holding its breath, waiting for the next moment to reveal the truth. The former king, clothed in rough servant garments, stood at the threshold of the throne room, his hands calloused, his head bowed under a weight far heavier than any crown could have given him. Around him, ministers and guards shuffled uncertainly, unsure what respect or fear now demanded of them. The people, those who had gathered overnight, whispered and peered through the gates, sensing the tension that even the high walls could not contain. Kilo remained seated upon the throne, calm and deliberate, the soft weight of the crown pressing down on his head. But the crown no longer felt like a prize. It felt like a promise a promise that power could exist for the good of others, if only one had the courage to use it wisely. The room was silent, except for the faint rustle of cloth and the subtle exhalations of men, realizing that their assumptions, their loyalties, and their fears had all been tested and failed. As the king stepped forward, every eye turned to him, expecting rage, a punishment, or perhaps an execution to mark the conclusion of the servant's brief rule. Instead, the man who had once ruled with terror took a slow, deliberate breath. He looked upon Kilo, and for the first time he saw him, not as a servant, not as a shadow, not as an obstacle, but as a man who had held truth when he himself had only held pride. The king's voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected, yet it carried more weight than the shouting, commanding voice they all knew so well. He admitted his failures openly, acknowledging that fear had never governed respect, that cruelty had never created loyalty, and that the people had always deserved more than what he had given them. There was no mockery, no punishment, no pretense. For the first time, the former king spoke as one human to another, as a man humble before both his servant and his kingdom. Kilo, in turn, remained seated listening, allowing the word to flow over the court like water over stone, reshaping the understanding of all who stood within the walls. By the time the sun had climbed high, the transformation was undeniable. Kilo was elevated, not merely as a symbolic act, but as the first royal voice in the history of Zambora, a role that gave him influence alongside the king, a voice to advise and to guide with wisdom rather than intimidation. The former king had learned that authority without empathy was empty, that power without listening was brittle, that a crown alone did not make a man worthy. Together, they began to reshape the kingdom quietly, correcting injustices, redistributing resources, and ensuring that the voices of the people mattered as much as the decrees of the throne. Outside the palace walls, whispers of the night's events traveled fast. Parents told children about the servant who became king for a day. Farmers and traders spoke of justice finally shown. The legend spread, not as a story of fear, but as a story of transformation. And in the halls of Zambora, where silence had once ruled, laughter, conversation, and respect began to grow. They say that night, a servant became king, and a king finally became human. And in that truth, the kingdom found something stronger than any throne. It found the courage to live rightly,